Okay, I think we're going to get started, everyone. So, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for your lunch hour at 12 noon today. My name is Adrienne Esposito. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. I'm joined by with my colleague and co-host, Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Ty. I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters and the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund.
And we're delighted to be able to present this Zoom educational forum to everybody today. Just going to quickly tell you who our speakers are, and we're excited to have so many of our actually all of our regulators here who can talk to you about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. We will hear from today Dr. David Diamond, who is the Deputy Chief for Atlantic Operations of the Office of Renewable Energy Programs for BOEM. And BOEM, for those of you who don't know, is the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management. We also will be hearing from Gregory Lampman. Greg is the Director of Offshore Wind with NYSERDA. And NYSERDA, for those of you who don't know, is the New York State Energy Research and Development Agency. And last but absolutely not least are our colleagues at the New York State DEC. We have Karen Gaitis, who's the Bureau Chief of the Bureau of Energy Project Management at DEC. And she's joined with Cassandra Bayer, who's the Bureau Chief of Marine Habitat. So we really appreciate everyone coming and attending. And before we get to our guest speakers, we want to talk to you about why we're doing this. Why are we making this monumental transition in our energy infrastructure here in New York State? The title of this program is Why Wind Works. Next slide. And just as a quick reminder, we are in a tremendous time in the period of history for the globe, and we are actually changing the temperature of our globe. And the United Nations, once again, this has been almost every year for several years, released another report in 2023 stating clearly that human activities through emissions of greenhouse gases have unequivocally caused global warming. And that means that our actions are causing it, and our actions need to repair it. Next. I just like everyone to know the statistics, because sometimes I hear questions, which are great to hear, about the cost of wind and the cost of transitioning. But as we do that and answer those questions, we need to keep in mind the cost of not transitioning and continuing to stay on fossil fuels. According to NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, just this year, between January and August, the country experienced 23 groundbreaking and record-breaking disasters that contributed to 253 deaths, and each incident exceeded $1 billion with an economic total cost just in the first 8 months of this year of almost $58 billion. Next. So the cost of doing nothing is also very critical. Let's go to the next slide. Wildfires is another big issue. So it's not only the economic cost, but is the cost to our health. You all saw the orange skies. It looked apocalyptic, but it also is the fine particulate matter contained in that smoke and that air is a very serious health impact, not only for people who are sensitive and have respiratory ailments, but for even healthy people. The fine particulate matter makes puncture marks in your lungs and respiratory system that cannot be repaired. Next. Sometimes people ask about what will the price of wind do to electric rates. And I think it's important just to keep in mind, this is the price of electric from 1990 to 2022 without wind. And this is what happens when we stay addicted to fossil fuels. As you can see, the cost of electric has doubled in this time frame. And then from 2022 to this year, it increased another 120%. So the cost of electricity is on a rapid incline with staying addicted to fossil fuels. Next. Keep going.
So I think stating the obvious, we need to transition how we get our energy, and the state of New York really has had big leadership when it comes to this. In 2019, the state of New York adopted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is the most ambitious climate change law in the country. It requires that we receive 70% of our energy from renewable energy sources by 2030, and for us to have carbon-free electricity by 2040. By way of comparison, we have roughly 27 to 29% of our power right now comes from renewable energy. So we have a ways to go to get to emissions-free energy, but we are making progress. We have to do this not just for the energy sector, but we ultimately need to do this for the entire economy. Obviously, today we're focusing on wind. There is also a requirement in the law that we get to 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035, since that is going to play a big role in how we're able to transition into renewable energy. We can go to the next slide. Look, we're talking about wind energy. This is not a new technology. It's just where it's coming from. Basically, where you're harnessing the energy that's in the air from the changes in the dynamics of the air, attaching it to collecting it with a wind turbine, a blade that is connected to a rotor, which turns a generator, creating electrical energy. We are not engineers. Some of the other folks might be, but it is something that people can really readily understand. We can go to the next slide. I think what's really important is that offshore wind power is not new, right? The first offshore wind project in the world was done in Denmark, and it was erected in 1991, and it was decommissioned in 2017, having been used for 25 years. So this is not a new technology. It's new to New York, it's new to the US, but it's not new to the world. Next slide.
And with that, we think it's interesting for people to note that Europe currently is using 28,000 megawatts of offshore wind power. Next slide. China, not known for their forward-thinking pro-environmental policies, is using 27,000 megawatts of offshore wind for their energy grid. And that might make you wonder, how much do you think the United States is using? So you can put your answers in the chat, but I'll tell you. Next slide. 42. There we are. Not really leading the nation in the development of this type of renewable resource, but we have one particular offshore wind project. Next slide. Off of Block Island. These are just 5 turbines. They supply the electricity for Block Island there. They were used to substitute 3 different diesel power plants that existed on Block Island that were old, very dirty, very noisy, very expensive, and breaking down. And the state decided to substitute. It's actually rather large success story. Keep going.
So we have here in New York a whole bunch of projects that are in process. BOEM leases some land out in the ocean, and in New York, we're lucky enough that we have a number of projects that have been selected to bring renewable energy into our state. We wanted to show folks where they're located. It is quite far from land. None of them are terribly close to shore. So that's something that I think a lot of people have questions about very often. We can go into a little bit more detail in the next slide. We have the first project is actually under construction. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. South Fork Wind is New York's first power project for offshore wind. It broke ground in February of 2022. It's presently under construction. The picture you see on the left is actually the first turbine that is in the water for that project, and it's very exciting. We're expecting that they're going to start bringing power to shore sometime in December. So it's truly exciting. It's going to be 12 turbines, cost about 30 miles east of Montauk. And there's a cable that's been built in East Hampton via Wainscott that has already been constructed, and there's a substation out in the ocean. So, which is why we know we're going to get power from this turbine very, very soon. It's truly a great step forward, but that's just the beginning. If you can go to the next slide. Right, we have 5 projects that are in various stages of permitting that have contracts with the state, which have, they're all those places on the maps. Empire Wind 1 and Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind are 3 projects that have been approved or that are going through permitting processes. And actually Empire Wind 1 recently got some approvals from BOEM. And they will generate, millions of houses worth of energy. They're by Equinor. Then South Fork and Sunrise Wind are by a company called Ørsted. Again, they're going through their permitting processes for the other projects, but it's going to really power hundreds and thousands of homes. We can go to the next slide. Very recently, the governor and NYSERDA announced 3 new projects: Attentive Energy, Community Offshore Wind, and Excelsior Wind. All of these projects combined are going to have New York getting more than 8,000 megawatts of power from renewable energy. So these are from some new companies. We're going to learn more about them later on. But Attentive Energy is a combination of a company called Total and Rise Light and Power. Community Offshore Wind is a company called RWE and National Grid Ventures. And Excelsior Wind is being developed by Vineyard Offshore Wind. So we're very excited about all these. But again, these are going to power more than 2 million more homes are going to be powered from offshore wind because of the projects that the governor announced earlier this fall. So it's really an exciting time. New York truly is a leader, so that we can move off of where we've seen very low amounts of renewable energy or of offshore wind energy in the United States compared to Europe and even to China. We're making a big step forward on this. I think we can go to the next slide. And so with that, we want to get to our presenters who have more details and can talk a little bit about the roles that the various agencies play, because this is not something that's just driven by developers. It's something that is highly regulated by state and federal regulators. They take into consideration a lot of impacts people have raised with us. And so I am pleased to turn it over to Dr. David Diamond from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julie, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone this afternoon. And I think this is really timely since, as you mentioned, BOEM did have a major announcement for the Empire Wind project last week. On November 21st. We announced our record of decision under the National Environmental Protection Act, which indicates our intention to approve the Empire construction operation plan. So that's a very significant milestone. So I've got a few slides I'll present here. Let me go ahead and share my presentation. See if this still works as it did when we went through it a few minutes ago. Okay. Yeah. So I'm the Deputy Chief for Atlantic Operations in BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs, and even though I focus on the Atlantic, which is where most of our permitting construction activities are occurring now, I'll try to also give a kind of a picture of our national renewable energy program in the Outer Continental Shelf, and then talk about our permitting processes. And then show some just an overview of some of the activities we have both nationwide and then in the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf. So first, I'll just give kind of an overview of BOEM's mission and goals with respect to renewable energy. BOEM is a relatively small bureau within the Department of the Interior, but we have responsibility for managing over 2.5 billion acres of the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf, which is federal waters generally extending from 3 miles offshore in the U.S. exclusive economic zone, out to about 200 miles offshore. And our missions to develop energy and mineral resources in the outer continental shelf, that's traditionally been oil, gas, and sand and non-energy minerals, but we do have a tremendous amount of activity in renewable energy, particularly wind energy, and a lot of that's been focused by the administration's goals. And specifically, it started with an executive order calling for Department of the Interior to identify ways to increase renewable energy development, both onshore and offshore in public lands. And then our specific goals for renewable energy, which is 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind, which is a technology applicable to deeper waters by 2035. So, and as I mentioned, our BOEM's energy development responsibilities, it's traditionally focused on conventional energy and minerals, but we received authority to do renewable energy under the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and our programs expanded very dramatically since then, and particularly just in the last 3 years of the administration, in order to meet the 30 by 30 and 15 by 2035 goals that I mentioned. And these pictures here also show the 4 regions of the OCS that we operate in: the Atlantic, Pacific, Gulf of Mexico, and Alaska regions. And we actually do have renewable energy leases in 3 of those 4 regions. We have leases in the Pacific. We just had a lease sale in this summer in the Gulf of Mexico, and we have 1 renewable energy lease. And we have most of our activity in the Atlantic outer continental shelf. So I'll talk a little bit about our permitting process and the steps we go through from leasing to permitting to construction and operations. But something I want to provide for context is that even though BOEM has kind of the lead agency responsibility for permitting for most projects, it's really a partnership with our other federal agencies, because we do permitting under our authorities, kind of contingent on permitting processes by a number of federal partner agencies, including the National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Environmental Protection Agency, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and other agencies, as well as working very closely with state agencies and tribal nations at all steps of the planning and the permitting process. And it's really a partnership, because all the pieces have to come together, both offshore and onshore, to be able to get one of these projects to completion. So with that context, I'll talk about BOEM's responsibility and processes. It's really 4 kind of distinct processes: the planning and analysis processes leading up to our renewable energy leasing, then the site assessment that occurs after a lease is issued, and then the permitting, then the construction. And at that point, there's operations, which can last for up to 30 years, and decommissioning. And those 5th and 6th steps in the process, operation and decommissioning, is where we kind of hand off responsibility to our sister agency, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, although they are one of our cooperating partners at all steps of the process. To talk a little bit more specific about BOEM's processes, so you see the planning and analysis process starts several years before we actually hold a lease sale and offer wind energy leases. And we identify areas. We go through a very rigorous consultation and analysis process to kind of balance all stakeholder and competing ocean user needs to try to determine what areas to offer for lease. This usually leads up to holding a lease sale, which is a competitive auction. And once leases are awarded after that sale, then the lessee will develop a site assessment plan, which usually takes about a year. We'll review and if we approve that plan, that'll provide authorization to conduct site assessment activities, which may last up to about 5 years, and leads to the development of an actual construction operations plan for the project. And once that's submitted to BOEM and we deem that that's complete, we'll enter into our processes under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. This leads to, we'll issue a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement. And there's a 2-year legal window for all the NEPA analysis. And that's when a lot of the other consultations with our federal, state, and local partners occur. There's a number of other consultation processes and legal processes that happen simultaneously, leading up to our record of decision under NEPA and our ultimate approval of the construction operations plan. And as I mentioned, we got to that record of decision for Empire Wind just last week after a several-year NEPA process. So once we issue the construction operations plan approval, then we kind of hand off to the Safety and Environmental Enforcement Bureau, and they'll review and provide concurrence on the final design installation reviews, and then at that point, subject to all the other permits from other federal agencies, the developer will be able to actually begin construction, and then that leads to hopefully a 30-year or more lifespan, and then eventual decommissioning at the end of the turbine's lifespan. So that's kind of an overview of our permitting process and just what it takes and the timing to actually get to construction and operations. So the last couple of slides will just provide kind of a snapshot of where we are now, both nationwide and with our projects in the Atlantic. So this slide's kind of an eyeful, but it just provides kind of a real overview of all the different areas we have, various stages of those processes, planning and leasing processes going on, and then kind of the order of magnitude of the number of projects we have under review now. As you can see in the Atlantic, we've got 18 projects where construction operations plans have been submitted. We actually have 33, or well, the slide shows 33. As of this last week, it was actually 34. One of the projects in our Kitty Hawk lease was split into 2 separate leases, so 34 leases issued. We have active leases in the 3 regions that I mentioned: Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf of Mexico. And we have 4 other potential lease sales that we're considering for 2024. A sale on the Central Atlantic, a sale in our Gulf of Mexico, second sale in our Gulf of Mexico region, a sale in the Gulf of Maine, and also a sale off the coast of Oregon in the Pacific region. So lots of activities going on right now. And we have of the 18 construction operations plans that have actually been submitted and deemed complete, we've issued 6 records of decision already, and we have 2 wind farms that are actually under construction: the South Fork wind farm that was mentioned before, as well as Vineyard Wind off the coast of Massachusetts. So very exciting time. And I'll just end by showing a snapshot of the projects that we actually have on what we call the Fast 41 dashboard. That's the Federal Permitting Infrastructure Steering Committee dashboard, which most offshore wind projects, once they reach once a construction operations plan's been submitted and deemed complete, they'll go on the dashboard, and that'll help with the interagency coordination of the permitting process. You can see all the projects we have here and the kind of order of magnitude of the power that's going to be generated, and this shows where they are in the dashboard milestones. I will caveat for the 2 wind farms under construction, Vineyard and South Fork, we show a kind of nominal 2-year construction period, but those construction periods are going a little bit longer than that. But as I mentioned, it's an exciting time, and we have a lot of activity, and look forward to answering any questions later in the present in the discussion period for today's event. So thank you, and again, appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate it. Our next speaker, moving right along, is with NYSERDA. We have Greg Lampin, and Greg, as I mentioned, is Director of Offshore Wind Energy. So who better to talk to you about what New York State's doing on wind energy? And Greg, I just want to mention to you, we're getting lots of questions in the chat about is there a new cable route for Empire Wind 2? So if you could weave any information into your presentation about that, I think that'd be helpful to our audience. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Julie, and thank you everybody at WindWorks New York. So Greg Lampin, I'm the Director of Offshore Wind at NYSERDA, and I think some of the introduction material is going to cover some of what I have today, so I can skip over a few slides pretty quickly. Next slide, please. Just want to give a quick overview of New York's role in the offshore wind energy development sector, just kind of as BOEM has done on the federal side, talk a little bit about our portfolio, and I pulled out a few select activities that we're engaging in the near term that you might be interested in, as well as some next steps. Next slide, please. So first, as was suggested in the beginning, all of our work in offshore wind energy development in New York is predicated on the New York State Climate Act that was passed in 2019. We are particularly focused on our 70% electricity from renewable energy by 2030 goal, and specifically the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2035. So we are working to keep all of our projects apace of achieving those two goals in particular, but also thinking about the broader goals that go out to 100% zero emission electricity by 2040 and the 2050 goal in greenhouse gas reductions. Next slide, please. So for New York's role, NYSERDA plays a bit of a hub in the development of offshore wind energy, but we certainly don't do it alone. So NYSERDA works in a lot of facets of offshore wind, everything from supply chain development to workforce development and environmental issues and related. But our main mechanism in supporting offshore wind is through purchasing long-term OREC contracts, or offshore renewable energy certificates. And I'll talk a little bit more about what they are in just a moment. But we have that buying power on behalf of the state to bring that renewable energy into the state and compensate developers for production of that electricity. We also undertake a lot of other activities, but many of them are done in concert with our sister agencies in New York, as well as our federal agencies. So for example, on energy policy and offshore wind strategy development, NYSERDA does a lot of work on that, but we do that very closely with the Public Service Commission and the staff at the Department of Public Service. We also do that on the environmental side with groups like DEC, and on the maritime side with groups like Department of State. And so there's a lot of integration and coordination of work in that space. We do a lot of work on transmission planning and transmission planning analysis. So New York does not have a state energy office, and NYSERDA plays that role to some degree. But we do that again in close concert with our colleagues at Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission, as well as the New York ISO, who's responsible for the bulk transmission grid and the energy markets in New York State. We work on supply chain and workforce development with partners across the state, including Empire State Development. You may not know that NYSERDA sponsors a lot of research related to the environmental implications of offshore wind. So we're coordinating the New York State Cables Working Group to try to make sure that the cables can come to shore from offshore wind projects in a way that's responsible. But we also are sponsoring projects like seeding surf clams to see if we can increase the population of surf clams to support the commercial fishing industry. We're also working on issues around spatial modeling of marine mammals and fisheries and passive acoustic monitoring for marine mammals. So trying to understand the implications of offshore wind on the things that we all find dear, and figuring out how can we minimize or reduce those impacts or risks. Stakeholder engagement, certainly all of the agencies on this slide are responsible for stakeholder engagement, but we do a good deal of that. A lot of it is coordination with technical stakeholders through our technical working groups. And then ultimately, state and federal regulatory processes. Again, New York is not a regulator. We do not issue permits, but we do work to make sure that all of our projects are built in a way that's responsible, that satisfy the statutory requirements, but also think about how can we make that permitting process more efficient so that these projects can move along more quickly while still maintaining the oversight that they need on the environmental side. Next slide, please. So our authority to purchase renewable energy certificates comes from the Public Service Commission. They issue orders that basically put the guidelines under which we can procure that offshore wind energy. To date, NYSERDA has issued 3 solicitations on about a 2-year cadence. Back in 2018 was our first, 2020 was our second, and the 2022 awards were recently announced. And today we'll be releasing our 4th solicitation. Next slide, please. So we get a lot of questions about what exactly is an OREC. And so first I'll call your attention to the stacked bar chart on the right, because this is a real simplification of it, but I think it helps people understand what we're actually purchasing. So when you look at the index OREC strike price, that top bar, that is the price that a developer bids to the state to build the offshore wind project. We call it the strike price. It's the all-in price that it takes for them to construct and operate that project over the 25-year term. That strike price is paid for through 3 different revenue streams: the market capacity price and the market energy prices. These prices are provided to the developer, the offshore wind energy developer, just as they're provided to any fossil fuel energy developer. So if you're generating electricity and selling it in the wholesale market on the grid, you receive a market capacity price and a market energy price. These change over time based on your time of day of generation, your seasonal time of generation, and the location in which you're injecting that energy in the grid. And it's the same market that all the fossil generators participate in New York. But on top of that, in order to get the price to build the offshore wind project, there's an OREC price, and that's the piece that we're actually paying. What's nice about the OREC price is that as the capacity, if the capacity or energy market prices increase, the amount of payment for the OREC decreases. And if the amount of, if the cost associated, if the revenues generated through the energy prices or the capacity prices decrease, the OREC price goes up. What this provides basically is a stabilizing effect on your energy bills. So it helps stabilize those energy bills over the 25 years so they do not become volatile associated with global events like a war in Ukraine and our export of natural gas. So we sometimes describe these OREC prices as the environmental benefits or the environmental attributes associated with the renewable energy that we're procuring. And we say that because electricity production from fossil fuels creates the challenges that Adrian described in the beginning, climate change issues, which we all pay for through our insurance bills, or even infrastructure replacements from issues associated with flooding that we pay for through our local, state, and federal taxes. In addition, there's also issues associated with the emissions of SOx, NOx, or fine particulates, which can have health problems, and we pay for that through our health insurance, or perhaps through asthma in children and related. So this incremental price that we're paying on top of what the fossil generator get is really used to offset that and to make the projects whole. But NYSERDA purchases those ORECs through a competitive procurement process. And then the utilities across the state are obligated to buy those ORECs from NYSERDA at that value in relation to the energy use within their utility zone. So the cost of offshore wind is spread across the ratepayers of New York. So that's the way that it's paid through your electric bills, not through your tax bills. And finally, again, having a fixed 25-year term contract also helps with stabilization of electric bills over time. Next slide, please. So just a few provisions that we do in our contracts. So we are buying these contracts and we do not pay anything to developers until they actually start generating electrons. But we do include in the contracts a number of provisions. So our scoring criteria is set by the Public Service Commission at 70% based on price, 20% on economic benefits, and 10% on viability. But we can obligate the developers to do a number of things that we see as valuable to the state of New York. So and this is just a short list of some of them, but obviously we are encouraging economic benefits and in-state spending. This can be on using the workforce in New York, but it is also related to investments in supply chain. We are requiring developers in some cases to have a mesh-ready design, which will allow us to integrate offshore wind energy sites to one another, which will help with reliability and deliverability into New York's grid. We spend a lot of time with our stakeholder groups through our technical working groups we call TWIGs. They're environmental and fishing and maritime and jobs and environmental justice. And our developers are obligated to coordinate and work with those groups as well. We obligate labor agreements and labor peace agreements. We require the submission and evaluate the bids in part based on environmental and fisheries mitigation plans and stakeholder engagement plans. We obligate the minimum purchase of U.S. iron and steel to support the development of that industry in the U.S. U.S. iron and steel is much cleaner than overseas iron and steel, and we value that, and we want to see that industry built in the U.S. We require benefits to disadvantaged communities, including workforce training. Developers are obligated to commit $10,000 a megawatt to support monitoring of regional wildlife and commercial fisheries, key commercial fish stocks. The intent here is that a developer is doing a lot of investigation of their individual lease area, but there isn't a lot of work to integrate lease areas to one another. So it's thinking about the build out of multiple projects and can we understand ecosystem change or stability as it relates to that by encouraging and requiring this sort of investment. We require transparency in environmental data, so sharing of that data so people can see what's actually going on and what's being collected. And then we also have things like lighting control obligations, fisheries compensation obligations, commercial fishing gear loss obligations, and a host of other things that are included in our contracts when you're selected by New York. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is the projects that we currently have under contract or that we recently announced. But what you're looking at is roughly just between 20 and 25% of the state's electric load on these projects. So we are, and a lot of people don't think about it in megawatts or gigawatts, but that's basically what it reflects is closing in on 25% of the state's electrical energy is embedded in these contracts. So it's a pretty appreciable investment. One of the questions that we got was what's going on with Empire Wind 2 and the cable fall into Long Island. And so just a little backstory here. So you probably are aware of the veto that the governor had for parkland alienation as it relates to that particular project. And the governor's reason for that was the fact that there was a lot of concern from the local elected officials, the state elected officials in particular, as it relates to that project and some locals within the community. And the governor's message was not one of anti-offshore wind, but really was one of requiring developers to spend time in those communities to gain the support or at least the acceptance of the project coming and interacting with their communities. And so it was a message to developers, you need to double down on these efforts and work harder. And so that is not necessarily the end of that project. So Equinor, Empire Wind 2 still has a contract with NYSERDA. They are still trying to think through how exactly they can have that project proceed. But it is really in Empire Wind 2's court right now to try to make that project work and find routes that will be acceptable to those local communities. Next slide, please. Just to look at the future, we're working on a master plan 2.0 for deeper water. So we're thinking beyond the lease areas that BOEM currently has available to us. But also a lot of our work now is based on work that we had done with our original master plan, which helps guide how do we interact with people and how do we reduce the risks and increase the opportunities associated with offshore wind? And this planning effort really goes to that. And you'll hear more about that early next year. We'll be asking BOEM for additional lease area. And then late in the year, we expect to be releasing our final master plan, which will show a path which New York will advance into deeper water. Next slide, please. And just a bit of information for you. So we have a Learning from the Experts webinar series, which has been really well received. These are experts in the space. We have more than 35 of them posted on our website. And if you're interested in any particular topic about offshore wind, you can go there and listen to a 1-hour webinar from the experts on that topic. You can also submit requests for topical webinars that we can try to find experts to fulfill. Next slide, please. And one more. So we have a biennial offshore wind state of the science workshop. We call it a workshop because there's a lot of meetings that take place leading up to and at that event. It is the largest offshore wind wildlife related conference on the planet. And we're going to be hosting that next summer on Long Island. And we look forward to bringing experts from around the world together to leverage their knowledge and try to advance offshore wind in a way that is responsible to the wildlife and other stakeholders in the space. Next slide. And I think I'm done. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, sorry, next steps. So we are releasing our fourth solicitation today, a very busy day at NYSERDA. It's predicated on an RFI that we released earlier in the month, or that closed earlier in the month. So you'll see more details about that later today. We're also planning on having a series of open houses on Long Island and in New York City with our new developers and our current developers and NYSERDA staff. So happy to have you all out to talk to you about our work. And interact directly. And again, we're looking at making a request of new lease areas from BOEM early next year. Thank you.
Great. And Greg, if you could always keep in contact, let us know when all those open houses are, and we will email out to all the folks who are on this forum today, which we have almost 200. So it'll be a great way to get people the information about when and where these open houses are so they can ask questions in person if they would like to do so.
Absolutely. Apologies on going long.
Oh, no, that's okay. Okay, well, let's hear from our colleagues at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Karen?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to CCE and New York League of Conservation Voters for inviting DEC to participate in this virtual Lunch and Learn forum. Next slide. Great. So this is the panel for today. So again, I'm Karen Gaitis. I'm the Bureau Chief of the Bureau of Energy Project Management in the Division of Environmental Permits. And joined with me today is Cassie Bauer, and Cassie is the chief of the Bureau of Marine Habitat. So within the Bureau of Energy Project Management, we manage DEC's review and approval of energy projects and ensure compliance with applicable environmental laws and regulations. And then Cassie's Bureau works to monitor, protect, and restore coastal ecosystems, implement New York's Ocean Action Plan, and reviews permit applications for impacts to marine resources. And then beyond Cassie and myself, DEC has a team of professionals that work on the review of offshore wind projects, including technical staff and other divisions like water, fish and wildlife, and our Office of General Counsel. Next slide. So on the screen is DEC's mission. And the DEC offshore wind team fulfills this mission by identifying sensitive resources and environmental quality concerns and recommending ways to avoid and minimize environmental impacts during the siting of offshore wind transmission cables and port infrastructure projects. Next slide. So DEC staff are involved in many aspects of offshore wind planning and siting in both federal and New York State waters. So from the planning standpoint, DEC participates in a number of technical working groups, or also called TWIGs, with our partners at NYSERDA. NYSERDA established 4 offshore wind TWIGs to bring key stakeholder groups together with the offshore wind industry and state and federal regulatory agencies. And the TWIGs include fisheries, environmental, maritime, and jobs and supply chain. DEC also participates in several New York State interagency working groups, including the cable working group that Greg mentioned earlier, which developed the Offshore Wind Cable Corridor Constraints Assessment Report. And this report was a result of the collaborative effort of multiple New York State agencies with the purpose of increasing the understanding of challenges and opportunities relevant to offshore wind development. The report identifies siting principles to guide the development and siting of transmission cables to avoid impacts to sensitive resources, among other principles. And finally, on this slide, DEC is involved in environmental reviews conducted pursuant to NEPA. DEC participates as a NEPA cooperating agency for projects that have a connected action in New York State. And DEC also works collaboratively with other New York State agencies to develop a one state voice comment letter to BOEM. Next slide. So this slide highlights ways that DEC is involved from a regulatory standpoint. So our principal role in the review and siting of offshore wind projects is through the regulatory process. DEC reviews all project elements in New York State, both onshore and offshore, out to the 3 nautical mile limit. Project elements within New York State's jurisdictional purview include manufacturing, staging, and assembly areas, transmission cables, and points of interconnection, and operation and maintenance facilities. DEC ensures that all project activities are consistent with the Environmental Conservation Law, or ECL, and its implementing regulations. Next slide. So as far as the transmission cables, I'm going to walk through the main ways that DEC ensures that offshore wind transmission projects meet substantive requirements of applicable environmental laws and regulations. And we do this as a participant in the Public Service Law Article 7 process. Article 7 is a section of the Public Service Law that provides a single forum for reviewing the need for and the environmental impact of major transmission facilities. The process is overseen by the Public Service Commission, or PSC, which is the appointed board in New York State government located within the Department of Public Service, or DPS. DPS is the lead New York State agency for Article 7 reviews for transmission facilities. However, DEC participates in the process as a statutory party. In other words, the Public Service Law specifies that DEC is automatically a party along with several other New York State agencies. Pursuant to Article 7 of the Public Service Law, DEC is statutorily preempted from issuing permits required by the Environmental Conservation Law. DEC only retains permitting authority over federally delegated programs, such as the State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, or SPEEDs. Applicants, or offshore wind developers, must receive a Certificate of Environmental Compatibility and Public Need, or certificate for short, from the PSC prior to constructing a major transmission facility. The certificate includes conditions that are akin to the conditions that DEC would normally include in DEC's permits. Next slide. This flow chart outlines the main phases of the Article 7 process. While the detailed information is not easily readable on this slide, the intent is to show the overall framework of the Article 7 reviews. And I'm just going to walk through how DEC participates in each of phases of the Article 7 review. So for the pre-application phase, DEC participates in pre-application meetings with developers. We identify sensitive resources and environmental issues of concern, and we may issue permits for survey activities if needed. A note that I said earlier that we're preempted generally, but that starts with the application of the Article 7 application submission. So during the application phase, DEC reviews application materials and provides support to DPS staff and serves as technical experts for DEC's areas of expertise. Another phase that's not shown on this flowchart is the settlement phase, and settlement happens between the application phase and the hearing and decision phase. During settlement, DEC works with the applicant and other parties to formulate a joint proposal, which outlines the applicable laws and regulations, as well as the impacts of the project, with attached conditions that apply to project construction and operation. As I mentioned, this confidential settlement process begins after the application is submitted, and applicants and settlement parties meet regularly to negotiate proposed contents of the certificate. The hearing and decision phase is a phase in which DEC submits a brief in order to support the joint proposal that was developed during settlement. It also is a phase where the Public Service Commission must ensure that projects comply with applicable laws and regulations, including the ECL and DEC regulations. And finally, the post-certificate phase. If the certificate is ultimately issued by the Public Service Commission, the detailed review for the offshore wind transmission line takes place during this post-certificate phase. DEC reviews erosion management and construction plans, which include detailed project engineering drawings and plans. This may also include review of net conservation benefit plans for T&E species, threatened and endangered species. And we also attend pre-construction meetings and remain on call for issues involving DEC's jurisdiction. Next slide. So the main issues of concern that DEC focuses on during the Article 7 review are outlined on this slide. These are just some broad topics where we ensure that impacts are considered when siting offshore wind cables. For water quality and sediment management, we ensure that the developer considers best management practices to ensure compliance with New York's water quality standards. For benthic resources, benthic habitats are the communities located on the seafloor and can be disturbed from survey activities, cable laying, installation of hard structure. Of course, fisheries is a concern that we will participate in conversations on, and we recommend that at least there's a 6-foot burial depth and minimizing the use of cable protection measures to decrease the hazards and risks from snagging fishing gear on cables. Protected species, EMF, and the others listed here are other areas where DEC focuses on when we participate in the Article 7 reviews. Next slide. So in addition to the siting of offshore wind cables, DEC staff are also involved in the review of onshore support facilities for offshore wind. And unlike the transmission projects reviewed under Article 7, DEC retains permitting authority over offshore wind projects that involve manufacturing, assembly, staging facilities, and operation and maintenance facilities within New York State. And for these offshore wind projects, environmental reviews are conducted under SEEKR, and applications are reviewed under the Uniform Procedures Act. And the review of these permit applications involve coordination with federal and state partners. Provided a project meets permit issuance standards, DEC issues permits for work associated with the development of these onshore support facilities for offshore wind. So this concludes DEC's overview of our role in the siting of offshore wind projects. And on the next slide, these are the contacts from the DEC's offshore wind team that you can follow up with if there's any questions. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you. All right, so we do have a couple minutes left, and we have lots of questions coming in to the Q&A section here. I'm going to ask our panelists, as we ask you these questions, to please be succinct so we can get to the next question. Greg is smiling. Okay, we're going to start off with Michael Hansen's question. What percentage of electricity comes from fossil fuels in the US? Is the percentage decreasing with the increase of renewables? I guess that would be for you, David.
Yeah, so I can't speak to the actual numbers. I mean, I'd have to look at refer to kind of authoritative sources like Department of Energy, but I mean, right now, from an offshore wind perspective, we're really just at the beginning of the process. We have our first few wind farms under construction now. So even though it's as was mentioned before, it's a very small percentage of electricity provided by offshore wind, just the Block Island project. I think we're moving forward on our 30 by 30 goal. We've leased areas sufficient to meet the to provide over 30 gigawatts of power. So as our permitting processes continue, in these farms are constructed and the power starts coming on shore, we think that's gonna make a significant impact on the power grid. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
I do think it's important to note that here in New York downstate, 90% of the energy still comes from fossil fuels. So this is going to have, when we have offshore wind, will make a demonstrable difference in how much we rely on fossil fuels here in New York. Next, we have Nancy Anderson wants to know if recent European or Chinese offshore wind projects avoided cancellation based on the rising cost of money and materials, which have impacted or have been of concern here in New York. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with that.
I can take that one. Yeah. So we've had a lot of conversations with our European partners, and there has been a number of project cancellations. The ones of note are particularly in the UK. UK has done an excellent job of bringing down offshore wind energy prices over time. And in their last auction, they did not receive any bids because no one could build the projects at the price that they were allowing. And the auction before that, they had selected a few projects which attrited not more than 4 or 5 months after selection. And so I think they're seeing the same issues in Europe as we are. I think the big difference is the Europeans are advancing offshore wind because they're very concerned with natural gas being cut off from Russia. And so they're advancing it in the fear of freezing in the winter more than just for the benefits of the renewable energy. So they are very dedicated to advancing offshore wind to offset natural gas.
Great, thank you. I did not know that actually, so thank you. That was helpful. We got a couple of questions here about decommissioning, so we're going to just combine them into one. But people want to know, what is the process of a decommissioning and why do you have to decommission them? Can't they be upgraded and then continue to operate? As people talking about decommissioning, let's get them built first. But okay, Greg or David, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so this is Dave. I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. Yeah, so our regulatory and legal requirements are that we do have to consider the decommissioning costs and plan for decommission as part of the construction operations approval and all of the permitting that's required to begin building. So there's a legal requirement for that, and that's really nominally to ensure that the ocean bottoms return to the condition it was in beforehand. That being said, I know there's on the oil and gas side, there's a precedent with the Rigs to Reefs program where we've looked at other benefits that accrue from keeping the turbines there. I mean, we talk about a nominal 30-year lifespan, but those lifespans could go on. There could be requests for activities that'll or construction that'll extend that lifespan. When it does get to decommissioning, I think at that point there's regulatory processes and there's provisions that would allow for examination of what that decommissioning looks like. Is it a true decommissioning down to the bare ocean bottom, or is there like a rigs to reefs type provision that's allowed? But it is legally required, so we definitely do consider that up front.
Thank you.
Some folks have asked some questions about possibility of Great Lakes wind, and in particular, that's something that BOEM would regulate should someone choose to advance that.
Is it BOEM or NYSERDA they want to know?
I think the question was about.
I can take this one. So we recently published a series of reports on Great Lakes wind energy in New York. And so BOEM does not have jurisdiction in the Great Lakes. The seabed in the Great Lakes is owned by the individual states or Canada on the north side. And so it would be up to the responsibility of the states. That does not mean that the federal government doesn't have a role. So the federal regulators, thinking about fish and wildlife, for example, would certainly have a role in the permitting of those projects, but it wouldn't be the jurisdiction of BOEM.
Okay. I want to go to Sarah's question. We get this question a lot here at CCE as well. For NYSERDA, can you select one cable corridor through Long Island Sound so that the sound is only disturbed once, and rather than have multiple cables go through it?
Yeah, so this is the objective of some of the work that's going on with the cables working group, which is to understand what do we find valuable and how do we coordinate cables just like that. And I think what's going on that may not be absolutely obvious, but the Public Service Commission issued orders and the ISO has followed with the Long Island PPTN. It's a public policy transmission needs process by which they've announced a project that will build transmission on Long Island to support some grid constraints there. But they've done a similar one for New York City, which is in development now. And the idea is to have a transmission developer build between 4,770 megawatts of transmission up to 8 gigawatts of transmission through one developer. And in doing so, you really are providing that coordination that people are looking for. So they're going to be looking for bids into that process, but by the very nature of selecting one developer for all of that transmission, you will get coordination out of the process and a better outcome ultimately.
Okay, and I just want to accent, we know of, of the tremendous concern and commitment that many groups have to restoration and preservation of Long Island Sound. So we just want to plant that seed once again in your ear, Greg.
Absolutely.
I know we're at 1 o'clock, but maybe we can get one more question in. We have a senator from Connecticut who has written a number of questions, in particular related to noise thresholds, and they're wondering, in particular, is there a possibility of setting a noise limit threshold for construction to protect underwater life? So I don't know, BOEM, I think this is for you.
Yeah, so that's part of I mean, we do look very carefully at noise levels, and we coordinate closely with National Marine Fisheries Service. Like they'll issue permits, and under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, that will specify that as part of that permitting process, it'll specify noise levels for individual projects. And a lot of, I mean, there's we look to we look kind of holistically at the best available science on what kind of noise levels should be set, but at the same time, all that is done on a project specific basis, and there's a pretty robust requirements for monitoring and of monitoring sound levels as construction is going on, and that's specified in the terms and conditions of our construction operations plan approval. But there is very robust analysis that goes into setting sound levels that can occur during the pile driving during the construction phase.
All right, and lastly, we're going to do one question for the DEC. Can you just really quickly mention impacts on marine mammals and this false narrative about the dangers to whales specifically? So that's for, I guess, Karen or Cassandra.
Cassie, you want to take this one?
Sure, I can, be brief with this. That there's really no evidence suggesting that that offshore wind activities are impacting or causing mortality to whales. And you did have a previous webinar on this, so I suggest if anyone has any further questions, that was a great webinar. There's a recording online to go to that, and one of our DEC marine mammal biologist was on there presenting all of our information on that. So
That's true. Anybody wants to see it, it's on our YouTube channel, Citizens Campaign for the Environment's YouTube channel, and I think it's gotten over 1,000 views already as well, so it's pretty good. So we have to go now. Your lunch period is over, but I want to really thank all of our participants here. We appreciate your time and your talents and sharing your expertise with us. We did have almost 200 people on this Zoom, and the goal here is for CCE and the League of Conservation Voters to provide public education in this monumental historical transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. There were a lot in the chat, but we did try our best. Julie?
We are going to be making this available on YouTube. We will be providing, a number of you asked questions about the presentations.
Yes.
That is information we will be posting on the WindWorks New York website as well. And we will be holding additional forums like this in the future, so be on the lookout for that. If you have topics that you'd like us to take up or you have questions about, please feel free to contact either League of Conservation Voters or CCE. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you to our participants and our panel here. We appreciate it, you guys.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thanks.